Hi, welcome back as we read Chapter 2, Otis Takes Aim. Otis did not know what it was about Friday morning that made him feel he had to stir up some excitement. Maybe it was the crispness of the air. Maybe it was knowing that the next day was Saturday, or maybe it was because Mrs. Brewster had kept her eye on him for such a long time the afternoon before. First of all, Otis decided to go to school by the way of Tillamook Street when he saw Ellen Tibbets come out of her house. He chased her all the way to school. This made her hot and cross. "You stop chasing me, Otis Spofford," she panted when she was safe on the school grounds. "You stop chasing me," mimicked Otis. Ellen stamped her foot. After the first bell rang, Otis saw Augustine Allen come running down the street as fast as she could. Her face was red, and both her hair ribbons had come untied. When she had caught her breath, she said crossly to Ellen, "You said you were coming by for me this morning. I waited and waited until I was almost tardy." "I couldn't," said Ellen. "That old Otis chased me." Both girls glared at Otis as they hurried into the classroom. Otis did not go in with the others. Instead, he stood outside the door of room 11 to wait for the tardy bell to ring. He knew this worried everyone in the class because they were anxious to be 100% on time. When the bell buzzed through the halls, he waited 2 7/8 seconds before he stepped into the room. His timing was perfect. The bell stopped ringing just as he came through the door. Miss Gittler looked at Otis. "Remember what I said about comeuppance," she warned, and went on writing arithmetic or math problems on the blackboard or chalkboard. Otis knew that when he wanted to be, he was the smartest boy in arithmetic in Miss Gittler's room. This morning he decided he wanted to be. He worked his problems quickly, not because he cared about finishing first, but because he wanted Miss Gittler to scold him for not working, and then he planned to drop a sheet of perfect problems on her desk and wait for the look of amazement when she saw that he had not only completed his work, but had not made a single mistake. As soon as Otis finished his problems, he looked around for a good way to waste time. Maybe there was something interesting in his pockets. Besides a tangle of string, rubber bands, and bent paper clips, he found a rabbit's foot with most of its fur worn off, a couple of old milk bottle caps he carried in case he wanted to start a collection someday, a yo-yo with a tangled string, and a clove of garlic he had picked up from the drain board at home for no reason at all. Otis studied the clove of garlic, but he could not think of anything to do with it, so he put it back in his pocket. Then he tried to unsnarl the yo-yo string, but soon lost interest. Wishing he could think of something more interesting, he tore off a corner of his arithmetic paper, put it in his mouth, and chewed it. Then he blew it out and watched it turn and twist as it floated through the air and landed on the back of Stewie's neck. Otis quickly bent over his work before Stewie turned around. "Stewart, have you finished your problems?" asked the teacher. "No, Miss Gittler." Stewie wiped the back of his neck with his hand. "Then turn around in your seat," she said. "Something hit me on the back of my neck." Stewie looked suspiciously at Otis, who was chewing at the end of his pencil and staring at the ceiling as if he were thinking hard. "Never mind, Stewart. Go on with your work." Miss Gittler also glanced at Otis before she returned to the attendance report she was working on. That was pretty good, thought Otis, as he tore off a margin of his arithmetic workbook and chewed it and went into a wet ball. Then he looked around for a target. Across the aisle, he saw Ellen working feverishly on her problems. Otis knew Ellen always had trouble with arithmetic, and now he watched her counting on her fingers under her desk. She wrote an answer, erased it, counted on her fingers again, and wrote another answer. Then she tugged at a lock of her hair to make it grow faster. Otis could not see why Ellen was so anxious to have pigtails. What was the good of a bunch of hair flapping around all the time anyway? As Ellen turned a page, Otis took aim and hit her square on the cheek. Ellen gasped and put her hand to the spot just the way he expected her to. She, too, looked at Otis. "Ellen," said Miss Gittler. "Somebody hit me on the face with a spitball," Ellen complained. "Otis, did you hit Ellen with a spitball?" Miss Gittler demanded. "Who, me?" Otis asked. "Otis, you are not cooperating," said Miss Gittler. "Let me see your arithmetic." This was just what Otis was waiting for. Now the class would see the look of astonishment on Miss Gittler's face as he handed her the sheet of completed problems. Miss Gittler took the paper, glanced at it, put it on the corner of her desk. "You may get a library book to read until the others finish," she said, as she returned to the attendance report. "How do you like that?" thought Otis. He almost felt as if Mrs. Gittler was not playing fair. He was even more disappointed when he hit Augustine on the back of the neck with a ball of wet paper. All she did was turn around and stick her tongue out at him. There must be some way to make spitballs interesting. With a juicy wad in his hand, Otis looked around the room. He watched Linda Mulford walk to the teacher's desk for help on her problems. Linda was always going to Mrs. Gittler for help. As he watched Mrs. Gittler talking to Linda, an idea came to him. "Boy, oh boy," he thought, "this really ought to make something happen." Closing one eye, Otis carefully aimed a spot 1 inch from Miss Gittler's left ear. Then he let the soggy wad fly. He whizzed through the air exactly the way he wanted it to, skimming close to Miss Gittler's ear without actually touching it, and hitting the blackboard with a splop. "There," thought Otis, "that ought to get results." It did. Miss Gittler put down her pencil and looked at the class. Then she turned and looked at the wet spot on the blackboard. She looked at the class again and waited for complete quiet before she spoke. "Otis, you have been disturbing this class all morning." "Who, me?" asked Otis innocently. "Yes, you," answered Miss Gittler shortly. "Otis Spofford, if you throw one more spitball, I'll do something that will make you wish you never thought of spitballs." Then she turned back to Linda and her problems. Otis stared at her in surprise. "I guess you better look out," said Stewie. "Oh, be quiet," answered Otis. Something had gone wrong. This was not what he expected. Miss Gittler was supposed to tell him to sit in a chair by her desk where she could keep an eye on him. She wasn't supposed to leave him wondering what she would do if he threw another spitball. And Otis did wonder. So did the rest of the class. "What do you suppose she'll do?" George whispered. "I bet it's something awful," said Ellen. Otis thought and thought. He fingered a piece of paper and tried to think of what Miss Gittler could do to make him wish he had never thought of spitballs. He was so busy of thinking he forgot to be troublesome. What could Miss Gittler mean? Would she send him to the principal's office? No, that couldn't be it. Boys were usually sent to the office for tripping people or fighting in halls, and anyway, nothing very bad happened there. The principal just talked to you. Otis knew. He had been there several times. Maybe Miss Gittler would send a note home to his mother. Otis considered this a possibility, but decided against it because spitballs didn't really do any damage. He did not think Mrs. Gittler would ask his mother to come to school the way she had done when he discovered he could make smoke by rubbing his ruler hard and fast and against the edge of his desk. This had been hard on both the ruler and the desk, which, as Miss Gittler explained, did not belong to Otis but to the taxpayers of the state of Oregon. The class finished the arithmetic lesson and turned to their readers. Still, Otis wondered. He hardly listened to the boys and girls reciting from here to there reader. Without really thinking, he tore off a piece of paper and rolled it with his fingers. "Go on," urged Dewey. "Make a spitball." Otis looked at the paper. There was only one way to find out what Mrs. Gittler would do. "You'll be sorry," warned Tommy. Augustine was watching. "Scaredy cat," she wrote on a piece of paper and held it where Otis could see it. Otis ignored her. He looked at Mrs. Gittler, who was writing on the blackboard a list of words hard to remember. "Though, through, thought," she wrote. Otis rolled the paper into a smaller and smaller ball. Finally, just before it was time for the noon bell, he could stand it no longer. He had to find out. Quickly put the ball of paper in his mouth. Then, as everyone in the room but Miss Gittler watched, he carefully aimed at a spot 1 inch from her right ear. Just as the bell rang, the spitball whizzed through the air and smacked across the blackboard. Without saying a word, Miss Gittler opened the door into the hall. Otis was baffled. He was sure she had seen the spitball. It wasn't like Mrs. Gittler to say she would do something and not do it. But Miss Gittler, said Linda, when nearly everyone had left the room, "Otis threw a spitball." "I know he did, Linda," she answered. "But you said you would do something to him if he threw another spitball." "Yes, Linda, but never mind about it now." Miss Gittler smiled at Linda. Then she smiled at Otis. Otis began to be uneasy. In the cafeteria, some of the boys who had left the room ahead of him dropped of the line at the food counter to gather around Otis. "What did she do?" they wanted to know. "She didn't do anything," Otis boasted. "She's scared to. She knows she can't make me stop throwing spitballs if I don't want to." That old Otis Spofford," he heard Ellen say, as she took her place in line. "Mrs. Gittler let him do anything he wants to." "It isn't fair," agreed Augustine. "He's so awful, and I think she likes him better than anybody in the room." Otis was not so sure. There was something funny about the way Miss Gittler had smiled at him. Maybe he really was going to get his comments. When the class returned to their seats after lunch, Miss Gittler said quietly, "Otis, I want you to do something for me." "Yes, Miss Gittler," said Otis, thinking she had forgotten about the spitball and wanted him to clap erasers or run an errand for her. Mrs. Gittler said, "I want you to throw spitballs for me." The class gasped. "Throw spitballs? Whoever heard of a teacher asking someone to throw spitballs?" Even Otis was startled. He didn't know what to think, but he wasn't going to let anyone know he was taken off guard. "Sure," he said. "Any special place you want me to throw them?" "Into the wastebasket," answered Miss Gittler. "I want you to sit on a chair and throw spitballs into the basket." Otis grinned. The idea of sitting in front of the class to shoot spitballs into the wastebasket pleased him. But Miss Gittler said, "Take your paper, the chair, and the wastebasket to the back of the room." Otis took his time about moving the chair and the wastebasket. "Quickly, Otis," said the teacher. "Spitball Spofford," whispered Stewie. Otis settled himself on the chair and tore off a piece of paper. After chewing it, he threw it into the wastebasket in enough force to make a noise. He was pleased when the whole class turned around to look at him. "All right, people, there is no need to watch Otis. We all know what he looks like," said Mrs. Gittler, as she took her pitch pipe out of her desk and the class got out its music books. Otis chewed and threw. At first the boys and girls peeked over their shoulders at him. But Miss Gittler started the singing lesson with a song about a barnyard. The class had so much fun imitating the sounds of different animals that they all lost interest in Otis. "Moo, moo," went the first row, taking the part of cows. The second row, who took the part of chickens, made such a funny cackles that the whole class laughed at Miss Gittler. Had to start the song again. Otis chewed more and more slowly. His mouth was dry, and he began to feel lonesome all by himself at the back of the room. He stopped making spitballs altogether and sat looking out of the window. It's been raining, and drops of sparkling water dripped from the trees. How good they look. "Go on with your spitballs, Otis," Miss Gittler reminded him at the end of the song. Then she started the class on row, 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 which was one of their favorites. Otis tore off another piece of paper. He took his time rolling it because he did not feel much like making a spitball. He put it in his mouth and chewed very, very slowly. He tried counting to 10 between each chew. His mouth felt drier and drier, and he decided he hated the taste of paper. Row, row, row your boat, sang the class. Otis sighed. He did not want to give up and admit to Miss Gittler that he had enough of spitballs. Not in front of the whole class. Gently down the stream, sang the class. Gently down the stream, thought Otis. Why did everything have to make him think of water? Doggedly he kept at his spitballs, but he worked slowly as he could. He was wondering how he could make his spit last until school was out. He ran his tongue around his mouth. Then he stuck it out as far as he could to see if it were swelling up and turning black. He could barely see the tip, which was still pink. That was a good sign. Maybe he could hold out. Merrily, 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 trilled the class. Suddenly the fire drill bell rang. He was saved. Otis leaped from his chair and was first in line at the door. If only he could get to a drinking fountain. He knew he could make his spit last until school was out. Quickly, children, said Miss Gittler. Get in line. Don't push, George. Come along, Augustine. As soon as the class was lined up 2 by 2, Miss Gittler opened the door and marched the boys and girls rapidly through the hall and down the stairs. She walked beside Otis, who looked longingly at the drinking fountain as they passed. With Mrs. Gittler beside him, there was no way he could get to it. The more he thought about that drinking fountain, the drier his mouth felt. If he could just turn the handle and let the cool water flow into his mouth for one instant. Outdoors the air was cool and damp. Otis opened his mouth and drew and gasped of cool air. He didn't care if he looked like a goldfish. Spitball, spitball, Spofford, the boys and girls whispered to him as he opened his mouth. Did it stop? Opened his mouth toward the sky in case it should begin to rain again. When everyone was out of the building, the bell rang. All right, class, about face, ordered Mrs. Gittler. The class turned. This left Otis and his partner at the end of the line instead of the beginning. Now it would be easier to get to the drinking fountain. As soon as the class reached the top of the stairs, Otis bent over so Mrs. Gittler would not see him and darted behind the line of boys and girls to the fountain. He turned the handle, and just as the stream of water rose almost to his mouth, he felt a hand on his shoulder. It was the principal. You know that no one is supposed to leave this line during fire drill, said Mr. Howe, and steered Otis back to his place in line. If that isn't my luck, thought Otis, now my spit will never last. As soon as the class entered the room again, Otis was tempted to go back to his seat and hope Miss Gittler would forget about the whole thing, but he knew that if he did, Stewie or Linda or someone would probably remind her. Anyway, he was not going to give in until he had to. He returned to his chair at the back of the room and tore off another piece of paper. Miss Gittler ignored him. Slowly he chewed the spitball and pitched it into the wastebasket. He tore off another piece of paper and looked at the clock. Another hour to chew and throw. A long, long hour. A minute clicked by, and after a long time another. Otis put the paper in his mouth, but he did not chew it. He just held it there a minute and took it out again. He never wanted to taste paper again. Mrs. Gittler had won. He only hoped she would not find it out. The teacher looked up from her desk. Well, Otis, she asked. Otis tried to lick his lips, but his mouth was too dry. I guess I've run out of spit, he said. Are you sure you're through throwing spitballs? Miss Gittler wanted to know. Otis did not want to answer the question, but he had to say yes. He said in a small voice, You may go out and get a drink before you return to your seat. Miss Gittler's eyes twinkled as she looked as if she wanted to laugh. Otis managed a sheepish halfway grin as he went out the room. Then he ran down the hall to the drinking fountain. How wonderful the jet of cold water looked. He drank in gulps, great gulps, stopped to gasp for breath, and gulped some more. Never had anything tasted so good. Otis drank for a long time before he wiped his mouth on his sleeve. He drank for such a long time that Miss Gittler came out into the hall to see what had happened to him. Was making me throw spitballs my comeuppance? Otis wanted to know. Miss Gittler laughed. It would be for some boys, but I'm not sure about you. That she shook her head. Otis, if only you would work as hard as on your spelling as you do on mischief. Ah, muttered Otis, because he couldn't think of anything else to say. Back at his desk, Otis found the class was no longer interested in what he had done. As far as they were concerned, the excitement was over. He also discovered that although he was no longer thirsty, he still had a funny taste in his mouth from chewing so much paper. As he worked at his spelling, it began to bother him more and more. He wished he had something to eat that would take away the awful papery taste. He fished through his pockets to see what he could find. Maybe he had an old stick of gum or something. In among his rabbit's foot, yo-yo, and rubber bands, Otis' fingers found the bud of garlic. He untangled it and looked at it. He wondered what it would taste like. He smelled it and decided it smelled bad and good at the same time. Holding it under his desk, he pulled off a section and peeled off the pinkish outside skin. He popped it in his mouth, bit, and for a terrible instant was sorry. Tears came to his eyes, but his nose tingled, and he blew the air out of his mouth. Instantly, everyone sitting near him turned and looked at him. Ellen wrinkled her nose. Augustine held hers. Wow, whispered Stu. What's that awful smell? Wow is right, thought Otis, as he gulped and blew again. He bit into the garlic once more. The second bite was not quite so bad as the first. Almost, but not quite. Trying to look as if he ate raw garlic all at the same time, he chewed a couple of times and blew again. Otis, Spofford, Ellen said in a fierce whisper, You stop that. Otis grinned. This was just what he wanted. Things were back to normal. He took a deep breath and blew as hard as he could at Ellen. Tune in next time for Chapter 3.